The words spoken by my son sliced through the quiet afternoon air, a cold, sharp, poisoned dart aimed directly at a heart that had only ever beaten for him. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 75 years old. For my entire existence, I had clung to a single, unassailable truth, that a mother's love is elemental, a force of nature that cannot be broken, bargained with, or diminished by the trials of the world. I believed that the sacrifices made in the quiet, dusty shadows of parenthood were seen, were valued, and that family was the last sacred sanctuary in a broken, cynical world. I was wrong. That profound miscalculation was a vast, silent chasm that nearly swallowed me whole, leaving me to question every memory, every sacrifice, and every decision I had made over the course of nearly 4 decades. It all began, its insidious, quiet unraveling, exactly 2 years ago, when Julian, my only child, the boy I had raised from the dust of my early widowhood, announced his intention to marry Clara. I was, or so I desperately convinced myself at the time, absolutely overjoyed. After watching him drift for years through a turbulent sea of fractured superficial relationships and short-lived romances, he had seemingly found an anchor. Clara was a wisp of a girl, a dedicated elementary school teacher with a shy, endearing smile and a reservoir of quiet respect that seemed, during those early family dinners, to be entirely genuine. I saw in her the daughter I had never been blessed to have, the final, perfect piece of a portrait of domestic bliss that I had been painting in my mind for decades. When my husband Arthur was stolen from me by a sudden, vicious heart attack 15 years prior, I had to learn how to manufacture strength from nothing. I had no other choice. I had worked as a certified public accountant for 40 years, a woman who understood ledgers, balanced sheets, and long-term investments. I knew the value of a dollar, and I understood how easily a secure future could crumble without meticulous discipline. I saved with a grim, quiet determination, securing a life of modest independence in our historic home in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle. 2 small apartment units, purchased decades ago as long-term investments, provided a steady, reliable murmur of rental income that supplemented my modest pension. I was by no means wealthy by the standards of modern Seattle's tech boom elite, but I lived a life entirely absent of luxury and completely full of dignity and peace. Or so, in my quiet ignorance, I believed. Julian was always indulged. I can see that clearly now, though the realization brings a sharp, bitter pang of regret. Perhaps my indulgence was a failing born of grief, a desperate, clumsy attempt to fill the vast, silent void Arthur's death had left in our lives. I tried to overcompensate with material things for an absence that was fundamentally spiritual. I financed his entire education at an expensive private university, bought his first car, paid off his credit card debts, and later provided the substantial down payment for his fledgling boutique financial consulting business. I never called it charity. I called it investing in his future, believing it to be the natural, sacred duty of a family. When he and Clara got engaged, I did not hesitate for a single second. I bled my personal savings of $15,000 to pay for the venue, the catering, and her dress, wanting nothing more than to give them a perfect day and a fresh start entirely free from debt. This was my first critical mistake. Shortly after the wedding, Julian approached me with that incandescent boyish smile he had polished since childhood, the exact smile he deployed whenever he wanted something from me. He told me that he and Clara were looking for a place of their own, but the rents in Seattle had become astronomical and insane. He asked if they could lease my vacant property on Chestnut Avenue. Knowing the market rate for that specific neighborhood was nearly $2,000, the practical accountant in me surfaced. I insisted on a standard, legally binding month-to-month lease agreement. But, out of maternal love, I set the rent at a mere $600, which was just enough to cover the building's maintenance expenses and property taxes. I told him this was a formal agreement, because good fences make good neighbors, and good contracts make good families. Julian laughed, hugged me warmly, and called me the best mother in the entire world. They signed the papers. Clara was radiant, and the first 6 months of the arrangement were a gentle, peaceful glide. The rent was paid on time. They came to my house every single Sunday for my slow-cooked pot roast, and Clara would call me during the week to ask for recipes. I felt essential, loved, and secure. I would sit in my green velvet armchair, the one Arthur used to read in, sipping tea from the white porcelain cup my own mother had left me, feeling a quiet, profound sense of meaning as I watched the gray Seattle rain fall outside my window. Then, the subtle hairline fractures began to appear. They were the kind of quiet shifts that only a mother senses but immediately wills herself to ignore out of fear of what they might mean. Julian started arriving late for our Sunday dinners, and then he stopped coming altogether, sending brief, hurried text messages about being swamped with clients. When he did appear, he was distant, his eyes glued to the phantom, persistent glow of his smartphone, and his answers to my questions were entirely monosyllabic. Clara's phone calls became increasingly infrequent, her voice sounding stretched, thin, like a wire humming with a tension she could not name. One Sunday evening, when they both managed to attend dinner, the visual disconnect became impossible to ignore. Julian was wearing a brand new, heavy, ostentatious Swiss watch that practically screamed its 4-figure price tag. Clara sat at my dining table with a designer leather handbag slung over the back of her chair, a luxury accessory that I knew cost more than my monthly mortgage and property taxes combined. I commented on the beautiful watch, forcing my voice into a casual, non-judgmental tone. Julian smiled, a smug, self-satisfied lifting of his lips as he angled his wrist to catch the light, telling me he had bought it himself because his consulting business was absolutely exploding. I nodded, my own smile a brittle, fragile facade. As a retired accountant, the math simply did not add up. If his business was indeed doing so spectacularly well, why were they still living in my subsidized apartment, paying a pittance of $600 a month? Why were they not actively saving to build their own life, one commensurate with this sudden, invisible success? I swallowed my doubts, choosing to remain silent because I desperately did not want to become the intrusive, critical mother-in-law. I convinced myself that perhaps they were just young and celebrating their first taste of real financial freedom. The truth, however, has a way of forcing its way into the light, dropped by a careless, cruel hand. 2 weeks later, on a chilly Tuesday afternoon, an automated phone call from my bank froze the blood in my veins. It was a pre-recorded message informing me of a rejected transaction on my primary checking account due to insufficient funds. I hung up the phone, my mind reeling in absolute disbelief. I opened my laptop and attempted to log into my online banking portal, but my fingers trembled so violently that I locked myself out. When I finally reached a customer service representative and verified my identity through a grueling series of security questions, the details of the transactions began to paint a horrifying picture. My checking account, which I kept fortified with a permanent balance of $5,000 for property taxes and emergencies, held a balance of just $42. I requested a detailed verbal review of the recent transactions, and each sentence from the representative felt like a physical blow. There were transfers of $500, $1,000, and even $1,500, all made directly to high-end electronic stores, luxury boutiques, and high-end restaurants over the past 2 months. The representative explained that these transactions had been authorized using the mobile payment app linked to the joint card on the account. That was when the air completely left my lungs. I remembered that 6 months prior, when I had undergone a minor knee replacement surgery, I had added Julian as an authorized joint user on that specific account so he could run errands, buy my groceries, and pick up my prescriptions while I was bedridden. Once I recovered, I had completely forgotten to remove his name from the authorization list. I had never dreamed that he still possessed the active digital card on his phone, and I had certainly never imagined he would use it. I asked the bank to freeze the account immediately, but they informed me that to permanently revoke a joint user's access and dispute the fraudulent charges, I would need to come to the branch in person with my legal identification. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table, staring blankly at the faded floral wallpaper, feeling the icy weight of the trail settle deep in my stomach. My own son, the boy I had protected and nurtured, was stealing from me. There was no other word for it. He was siphoning my limited retirement funds to finance a life of luxury, and he had not even granted me the dignity of asking for help. I took a deep, steadying breath, poured myself a glass of cold water, and resolved not to confront him immediately. As an accountant, I knew that anger was a poor strategy. I needed to understand the full, terrifying scope of the financial damage before I made my move. The next morning, I walked into the bank and met with Robert Sterling, my attorney of 20 years, who also happened to be a close family friend. Robert was appalled by the bank's detailed audit of the past 6 months. The paper trail was an absolute nightmare, rendered in black ink. Julian had stolen a total of $12,400 of my money earned through decades of hard work and saved through rigorous personal sacrifice. The nausea returned in waves as I saw the dates of the transactions. The expensive Swiss watch, the designer handbag, and even a weekend luxury resort stay in California for him and Clara had all been funded by my savings, entirely behind my back. Robert explained that because Julian was technically still listed as an authorized joint user, pursuing criminal charges through the bank would be a complex, painful process, but he assured me that what Julian had done was a profound, illegal breach of fiduciary trust, especially given my age. He drafted a formal demand for repayment and began preparing a file. I took the documents, placed them in a secure envelope, and decided to wait, holding on to a tiny, foolish sliver of maternal hope that Julian would eventually come to me, confess his actions, and beg for forgiveness. That foolish hope died a brutal, agonizing death 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon. Clara had called me that morning, her voice sounding genuinely weak and strained, claiming she was suffering from a terrible stomach bug and asking if I could possibly bring over some of my homemade chicken soup. I spent the morning preparing the soup, drove over to Chestnut Avenue, and used my landlord's key to enter the apartment quietly, not wanting to disturb her if she was sleeping. I called out her name as I stepped into the foyer, but the apartment was entirely silent. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen to leave the container of soup, I heard Julian's voice emanating from the small room he used as his home office. He was on a phone call, and his tone was mocking, arrogant, and laced with a cold, calculated cruelty that I had never heard from him in my entire life. He was talking to a friend, laughing sharply as he explained his brilliant plan. I froze, my hand remaining paralyzed on the hallway wall. Julian was bragging that he had anticipated I might eventually notice the missing funds, so during his last visit to my house, he had quietly accessed my filing cabinet and taken copies of my tax documents, my social security number, and my banking details. He laughed as he explained that he had used those details to call the bank, impersonate my financial advisor, and request a temporary hold and password reset on my primary credit cards. He told his friend that since I had finally noticed the missing money and frozen his access to the joint account, he had successfully blocked my access to my own primary lines of credit. He said that the old lady barely checked her statements anyway, and now that she was locked out, she would have to call him. She would have to beg, and she would finally learn who was truly in control of the family dynamics. He said it was high time she realized she couldn't treat him like a dependent child anymore. Standing in that dark hallway, The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air was sucked from my lungs, and my legs felt entirely hollow. My only child, the boy for whom I had sacrificed my youth, my career opportunities, and my personal happiness, was not merely stealing my money, he was actively hunting me. He was planning my public humiliation, calculating my financial ruin, and laughing about it with his friends. I silently backed away, left the container of soup on the kitchen counter, and drifted out of the apartment like a ghost. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, staring at the gray Seattle skyline through a blur of silent tears. The crushing weight of the betrayal felt like a physical boulder on my chest. I drove home in a daze, locked my front door, collapsed into my green velvet armchair, and wept. I cried for the son I thought I had raised, who was in reality a chilling, narcissistic stranger. I cried for my own bottomless, foolish naivety. But as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened in my living room, the tears stopped, and something else rose in their place. It was a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear rage that did not burn, but froze. I looked down at the white porcelain teacup in my hand, the one my mother had given me, which had survived decades of moves, losses, and hardships. I realized that I, too, had survived. I had survived the sudden death of my husband, the grueling demands of a competitive profession, and the quiet isolation of aging. I was not the fragile, helpless old woman my son imagined. If Julian wanted to play a game of financial control and psychological warfare, he was about to discover that his mother was a certified public accountant with 40 years of experience in identifying and eliminating bad debts. I spent the entire night at my desk, the methodical, precise accountant fully reinstated. I reviewed every single document in my possession, from the original deed of the Chestnut Avenue property to the exact terms of the lease agreement we had signed. As I read the legal language, a meticulous, final plan took shape in my mind. Julian wanted to make me beg. Instead, he was about to receive a lesson in contract law that he would never forget. The lease agreement I had insisted on contained a very specific, ironclad clause that allowed for the immediate termination of the tenancy and immediate eviction in the event of documented illegal activity, material fraud, or severe breach of trust committed by the tenant on or associated with the property. At precisely 8 o'clock on Friday morning, I called Robert Sterling at his office. I told him everything I had discovered, including the details of the phone call I had overheard. Robert's professional warmth instantly vanished, replaced by the cold resolve of an experienced attorney. He told me to email him the lease agreement and the bank statements immediately, and to meet him at his office at 3 o'clock that afternoon. When I sat across from his mahogany desk, Robert reviewed the documents in silence, his expression growing darker with every page. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of professional anger and deep personal sympathy. He told me that Julian's actions legally constituted elder financial abuse and identity theft. He assured me that because of the specific clauses I had insisted on including in the lease, my legal position was entirely ironclad. He explained that we could bypass the lengthy standard eviction process by serving an immediate 3-day emergency notice to vacate, based on documented criminal activity on the landlord's accounts. Robert asked me gently if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed. He reminded me that once we pulled this legal trigger, there would be no going back, and the relationship with my son would likely be severed forever. I looked out his office window at the indifferent gray city, thinking of Julian's arrogant laugh echoing in that hallway. And I felt absolutely no hesitation. I told him to proceed with the eviction, and I wanted it executed by a professional process server on Monday afternoon. Over the weekend, I worked tirelessly with my bank's fraud department, successfully proving the identity theft, changing every security credential, and permanently locking Julian out of my financial life. On Monday afternoon, I sat in my parked car across the street from the Chestnut Avenue apartment, watching in silence as the professional process server walked up the steps and knocked on the door. Clara opened it, received the legal envelope, and as she pulled out the documents and began to read, her face completely crumpled. I felt a sharp pang of guilt for her, but I reminded myself that she was collateral damage in a war that I had not started. I started my car and drove home, preparing myself for the inevitable storm. Over the next 3 days, my phone became a weapon. I received dozens of phone calls and a relentless barrage of text messages from Julian. His initial messages were demanding and angry, but as the hours ticked away and I refused to answer, they descended into frantic, desperate pleas. He claimed there had been a massive misunderstanding, that he urgently needed to explain, and that I couldn't do this to family. On Tuesday night, he came to my house, pounding frantically on the front door for nearly half an hour, shouting my name and begging me to open up. I sat in my green velvet armchair, sipping my tea, and listened to his desperate shouting without moving a single muscle. He had wanted to make me beg. Instead, I was forcing him to face the cold, unyielding reality of his own actions. On Wednesday morning, Clara called me from her phone, her voice completely shattered by weeping. She told me that Julian had finally confessed to her that he had used my money, but she swore on her life that she had no idea the funds were stolen, having genuinely believed his consulting business was finally succeeding. She begged me to give them one more chance, explaining that they had no savings left to pay for a deposit on a new apartment. My maternal resolve flickered for a brief second, but then I pictured the expensive designer handbag she had carried and the luxury vacation they had enjoyed at the direct expense of my retirement security. I told Clara calmly that my decision was final, that the lease would terminate on Friday evening at 6 o'clock, and that they had until then to completely vacate the property. When she sobbed, asking where they were supposed to go, I told her that was a problem of Julian's making, not mine, and I hung up the phone. Friday arrived, cold, gray, and heavy with anticipation. I spent the day preparing my house, cleaning every surface until it was spotless, and organizing my files. At exactly 5:45 in the evening, my phone lit up with Julian's name. I rejected the call. He called again, and again I rejected it. Then a text message appeared on my screen, begging for just 10 minutes of my time, admitting he had made a mistake but insisting that we were family. I let out a dry, bitter laugh at the screen. Now, when his comfort was threatened, we were family. At precisely 6 o'clock, a text message from Robert arrived. It was a photograph of the Chestnut Avenue apartment, showing boxes piled high on the sidewalk and suitcases stacked by the door. Robert's follow-up message informed me that Julian had stormed out of the apartment 30 minutes prior, shouting in a rage that his mother couldn't do this to him and that he was going to fix this. I knew exactly where he was going. 20 minutes later, a car screeched to a frantic halt outside my house, followed by desperate, heavy pounding on my front door. I rose from my green velvet armchair, smoothed down my clothes, and walked to the door with slow, deliberate steps, reclaiming my personal power with every movement. I opened the door. Julian stood on my porch, his clothes disheveled, his face a turbulent mix of panic and fury. He pushed past me into the foyer, shouting, demanding to know how I could throw my own son out onto the street. I locked the door behind him, walked back into my living room, and sat down in my armchair, clasping my hands calmly in my lap. I told him to sit down. My absolute calm seemed to infuriate him even further. He paced the room, waving his hands, demanding to know why I had canceled the lease and why I refused to answer his calls. I picked up a red folder from the side table and laid it on the coffee table in front of him. I asked him if he remembered when he was 10 years old and had been accused of stealing lunch money from the school office. He blinked, completely thrown by the question, asking what that childhood incident had to do with his current crisis. I told him that I had defended him back then because I trusted him, because that was what mothers did. I rose from my chair, walked to the window, and told him that for years I had defended him against his father's warnings that I was spoiling him, and against his teacher's reports that he was irresponsible. I had ignored them all because I desperately wanted to believe my son was an honest, grateful man. Julian spat back that he was not a criminal, claiming he had merely borrowed the money to cover a temporary cash flow issue in his business and had fully intended to pay me back. I turned around, looking him dead in the eye, and told him that one does not borrow without permission, and one certainly does not borrow to purchase luxury Swiss watches and resort vacations while their elderly mother is still working part-time to pay her property taxes. I opened the red folder, revealing the detailed bank statements showing the $12,400 he had siphoned from my account. Julian's face completely drained of color as the evidence stared back at him. He stammered that I had plenty of money, that I owned apartments and had savings, as if my hard-earned security gave him a natural right to steal from me. I recited the definition of theft to him in a cold, level voice, explaining that taking what does not belong to you without the owner's explicit consent is stealing, and that is precisely what he had done. Julian threw his hands up in defeat, pacing the room, offering a dismissive, rushed apology, and promising to pay back every cent if I would just let them move back into the apartment. I watched his performance, seeing the arrogance quickly collapse into desperate theatricality, and I felt nothing but a deep, hollow sadness for the relationship we had lost. I told him that the saddest part of this tragedy was not the money, which was just paper, but the total destruction of trust. Without trust, I told him, there is no family. Julian fell to his knees on my living room floor, literally clasping his hands together in a pathetic, desperate plea for forgiveness. He begged me not to leave them homeless, dropping a final, devastating bombshell, claiming that Clara was pregnant with my grandchild. The word hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A grandchild. The one thing I had dreamed of and prayed for since Arthur's death. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but as I looked closely at Julian's tear-streaked face, I saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was not a confession of joy, it was a weapon. He was using an unborn child as a final, desperate shield to manipulate me and escape the consequences of his actions. I realized that if I gave in now, I would be his hostage for the rest of my life, and this child would become his permanent leverage over my bank account. I took a deep breath, commanded my voice to stop trembling, and ordered him to get up off the floor. When he continued to beg, I raised my voice, commanding him with a steel that shocked him into silence to get up. He slowly rose to his feet, wiping his face. I looked at him, searching for any trace of the little boy I had loved so deeply. But he was gone, replaced by a hollow, calculating stranger. I congratulated him on the baby, my words tasting like ash in my mouth, and told him I sincerely hoped he would prove to be a far better father than he had been a son. I informed him that the eviction stood and that he had until 11 o'clock that night to remove the rest of their belongings from the apartment before the locks were permanently changed. The last of Julian's manufactured sorrow vanished, replaced by a dark, venomous hatred. He snarled at me, declaring that I was a bitter, lonely old woman who deserved to die alone in my empty house. He warned me that I would never see my grandchild, screaming that I had chosen my money over my own family. The words were designed to destroy me, and they hurt more than I can ever express, but I had already cried my tears. I told him in a chillingly calm voice that I would rather live the rest of my days alone, with my dignity intact, than be surrounded by people who only viewed me as an ATM. I told him to get out of my house. Julian threatened to hire a lawyer and sue me for wrongful eviction, but I smiled a small, cold smile. I told him that my attorney, Robert Sterling, would be absolutely delighted to present the court with the documented evidence of financial fraud, identity theft, and the transcript of his plan to make me beg. I added that we could even include his current attempts to use his unborn child as emotional blackmail. Julian stared at me in complete disbelief, realizing that his power over me was entirely gone. He turned, slammed my front door so hard the glass rattled, and vanished into the night. I collapsed back into my green velvet armchair, clutching the red folder to my chest like a shield, and finally wept for the grandchild I feared I would never get to hold. The days that followed were a long, gray fog of exhaustion and grief. A week after the eviction, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered it, and Clara's whispered voice came through the line. She told me that she had left Julian, unable to handle his erratic rages, his shifting of the blame onto her, and his growing obsession with seeking revenge against me. She explained that they had been sleeping on a friend's sofa, and Julian spent all of his time posting horrible, defamatory lies about me on social media, claiming I had abandoned my pregnant daughter-in-law. She added that he had even threatened to go to my former accounting firm to humiliate me publicly. 2 days later, Clara appeared at my front door. She looked completely exhausted, with dark shadows under her eyes, but her gaze was steady and clear. She handed me a paper bag containing the designer handbag and the jewelry Julian had purchased for her using my stolen money, explaining that she could not keep items bought with my pain. Before she left, she hesitated, pulled a small, blurry ultrasound photograph from her wallet, and placed it in my hand. She told me that the baby was innocent, and she hoped that one day, when she was settled, I could be a part of his life, because every child deserved a grandmother like me. She told me she was moving back to Denver to live with her parents, where she could raise her child in safety. I held the photograph with a shaking hand, whispering that the baby was beautiful, and watched her walk down my steps with a deep sense of respect. I took the returned luxury items to a consignment shop in downtown Seattle, and the $3,000 they fetched was immediately deposited into a brand new savings account under the name of Arthur Vance, Jr. I returned to a quiet, bruised rhythm of life, renting the Chestnut Avenue apartment to a lovely young couple who treated the property with respect. I took on a few consulting clients to keep my mind active, and I spent time with my friends, slowly healing from the trauma of my son's betrayal. My friend Diana Wells took my hand during coffee one afternoon, reminding me that loving our children does not mean allowing them to destroy us, and that setting boundaries is the ultimate act of self-preservation. 3 months later, Clara called me from Denver to announce the birth of her son, whom she had named Arthur Jr., in honor of my late husband. My joy was immense, but it was quickly overshadowed a week later when I was served with legal papers. Julian, in a final, desperate spasm of vindictive rage, had hired a low-grade attorney and filed a lawsuit against me in civil court, claiming wrongful eviction, breach of contract, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He was demanding $50,000 in damages. The trial took place in a sterile, brightly lit courtroom in downtown Seattle. Julian sat across the room from me, his eyes cold, hard, and utterly devoid of remorse. His attorney attempted to paint me as a wealthy, cruel, and vindictive matriarch who had weaponized her financial power to render her pregnant son homeless. But when it was our turn, Robert Sterling stood up and presented our case with surgical precision. He submitted the bank audits, the documented evidence of identity theft, the transcript of the phone call, and, most importantly, a sworn, notarized affidavit from Clara in Denver, detailing Julian's long history of financial deception and her complete support of my actions. The judge, a stern, experienced man, did not deliberate for long. He dismissed Julian's lawsuit with prejudice, declaring that the eviction was not only entirely legal, but completely justified, given the egregious nature of Julian's financial crimes against his own mother. Furthermore, the judge issued a formal restitution order requiring Julian to pay me back the $12,400 he had stolen, along with all of my legal fees. Julian's face turned a deep, furious red as the gavel struck the desk. As we filed out of the courtroom, Julian blocked my path in the hallway, his eyes burning with resentment. He hissed that I had won, that I had gotten my money, and asked if it was truly worth losing my only son. I looked into the eyes of the stranger who wore my son's face, feeling a quiet, steady peace. I told him softly that I had not lost my son that day. He had lost his mother, the very moment he decided her only value was the balance of her bank account. 3 months after the trial, I boarded a flight to Denver. Clara and her parents welcomed me into their home with open arms. When Clara placed little Arthur Jr. into my arms, 7 pounds of perfect, innocent new life, tears of pure gratitude streamed down my face. As his tiny fist curled tightly around my finger, I felt a hope that I had thought was permanently extinguished. It has been a year since that day. Julian eventually filed for bankruptcy to avoid his debts, meaning I will never see the restitution money. But the money was never the point. I sit in my green velvet armchair in Seattle, holding a warm cup of tea, looking at a photograph on my mantelpiece of Arthur Jr. smiling with his first 2 teeth. Clara is planning to move closer to Seattle next year so we can raise him together. I lost a son, a grief that remains a quiet scar on my heart. But I gained a daughter, a grandson, and most importantly, I reclaimed myself. I learned that setting a boundary is not cruelty. It is the ultimate act of survival, and that even in the coldest ashes of betrayal, a beautiful, brave new life can always find a way to grow.